Hey there, night owls. Tonight, we're stepping straight into one of the grittiest eras of history, the real Wild West. Forget the silver screen cowboys with perfect aim and polished boots. This was a place where the line between life and death was razor thin, and every day was a gamble. Think you could handle it? Don't be so sure. This was survival of the fittest, and the Wild West didn't play fair. If you're enjoying these late-night dives into history, hit that like button or consider subscribing. Your support keeps this journey alive, and I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment with your location and what time it is. Our little community never fails to amaze me with its reach. Now settle in, dim the lights, maybe grab a blanket, and let's wander into a time when simply waking up alive was a win. Tonight, we'll uncover why even the toughest among us might not make it through a single day in the untamed Wild West. Think of it. You've just been transported back to the American frontier of the 1870s. Sounds cool, right? Well, hold that thought. The moment you wake up, reality hits you hard. First, there's the smell. It's overwhelming. Not the fresh, pine-scented wilderness you'd hoped for, but a cocktail of odors that would make even the bravest city resident draw back. We're talking unwashed bodies, manure, and yes, probably raw sewage. It's a composition of unpleasant smells that doesn't go away. Hygiene? Not even a priority. Most folks considered a bath a once-a-month hard, if they were feeling fancy. Winter months? Forget it. Water was like gold out here, too precious to waste on things like bathing. Every drop was reserved for drinking, cooking, or keeping the crops alive. Washing yourself? A luxury most couldn't afford. As you pull yourself out of bed, or what passes for one, a straw-stuffed mattress crawling with bed bugs, your entire body aches. Every muscle scream from yesterday's hard labor, and the day ahead promises no relief. Life on the frontier in the 1870s wasn't just tough, it was relentless. There were no weekends, no vacations, and certainly no such thing as comfort. Whether you worked the fields, mined the earth, or wrangled cattle, your body was your only tool. And like any tool used too much, it eventually wore down. By their 30s, many were permanently hunched over, their joints stiff and aching. Think you've had a long day at work? Imagine spending 14 hours plowing stubborn fields, hauling buckets of water, chopping wood for the fire, or digging deep in the suffocating dark of a mine shaft. Frontier labor wasn't just hard, it was life-shortening. The average person lived only 35 years, a grim reminder of how brutal this existence could be. If it's winter, your cabin feels like an icebox, with temperatures inside dropping to a bone-chilling 20 degrees below freezing. Sure, you might have a fireplace, but you probably let it burn out overnight to save precious wood. Central heating, thermal underwear, forget it. Those luxuries are a century away. In the summer, it's a whole different kind of misery. Sweat soaks through every piece of clothing you own. And there's no fan, no AC, no escape from the relentless heat. Out here, the elements don't just test you, they remind you who's really in charge. Speaking of clothes, don't expect anything cozy. Men typically owned just two outfits: rough canvas or denim pants and cotton shirts that scratched and chafed with every move. For women, it was even worse. Multiple layers, chemises, corsets, petticoats, and long dresses. no matter how hot or cold it was. Dragging through dirt and dust, these outfits were uncomfortable, heavy, and almost never clean. Those stylish cowboy looks from the movies? Pure fantasy. The reality? Everyone looked and felt like they were wearing sandpaper. As you wrestle with the discomfort, your stomach interrupts with a loud growl. It's time for breakfast, if you can call it that. Hope you're a fan of beans, biscuits, and coffee, because that's pretty much all you'll be eating out here, and for every meal. The Wild West diet wasn't just boring, it was downright lacking in nutrition. Fresh fruits and vegetables, those were rare seasonal treats. Meat, if you could get it, came heavily salted or smoked, because refrigeration wasn't even a thing yet. And then there was scurvy, the nasty disease that made your gums bleed and your teeth fall out. It was painfully common, all because settlers couldn't get enough vitamin C, a problem we could solve easily today. Thinking the coffee might save the day? Think again. Cowboys always seemed to have a fresh pot brewing in the movies, but the reality was a whole other story. What you'd get was coffee boiled so long it could strip paint, bitter enough to make you wince. Some people even tossed in crushed eggshells or a pinch of salt to cut the edge. Still, it had caffeine, and out here, that was reason enough to drink it without a single complaint. Before heading outside, there's one thing you never forget to do: check your boots. Scorpions and snakes had a habit of sneaking in overnight, looking for a warm spot to rest. A quick shake wasn't just a morning routine. It was survival 101. One wrong step could land you with a venomous bite. And out here, miles from any medical help, that's as good as a death sentence. As you step outside your cabin, the sheer openness of the frontier hits you. The vast landscape is stunning, no doubt, with endless skies and rugged terrain. But it's also unforgiving. Out here, nature doesn't care about your plans. The weather can turn on you in an instant. One minute the sky is calm. The next, you're caught in a blizzard, a tornado, or a flash flood. Droughts linger like unwelcome guests, draining the life out of the land. If you're not ready for it, you're done. Maybe you've settled in a frontier town thinking civilization offers some safety. Well, that's true, sort of. But it's a different kind of danger. Towns in the Wild West were breeding grounds for disease, without proper sewage systems or any real understanding of germs. Sickness spread like wildfire. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, tuberculosis, you name it, they had it. And when an outbreak hit, it could wipe out half the town in just a few weeks. Now, let's say today's the day you decide to venture into one of these towns. What waits for you there? Let's find out. As you get closer to town, one thing becomes clear. There's no rhyme or reason to how it's laid out. Buildings are scattered wherever someone decided to put them, with no thought to planning or order. Forget paved streets, what you've got are dirt tracks that turn into swampy mud pits after a rainstorm, or choking dust bowls in the dry heat. Then the smell hits you, and it's even worse than you imagined. Horse manure is everywhere, piling up because horses are the main mode of transportation. There are no street cleaners or sanitation workers here. In some parts of town, the waste is knee-deep, especially in areas with heavy traffic. Flies swarm like they own the place, making it painfully obvious why disease spreads so fast in these conditions. Walking down the main street, you pass the saloon, the liveliest spot in town. But don't expect the swinging doors, piano music, and charm of the movies. Real saloons were nothing like that. Most were small, crude, one-room shacks with rough wooden bars and mismatched furniture. And the liquor? Far from smooth whiskey aged in oak barrels. Instead, you'd get raw alcohol, sometimes mixed with tobacco juice, pepper, turpentine, or even gunpowder to give it an extra kick. One bad drink could leave you blind or worse, but that didn't stop people from drinking it. The saloon wasn't just a place to drink, it was a magnet for trouble. Violence was a regular occurrence here, not because of grand showdowns or noble duels, but thanks to drunken arguments that spiraled out of control. In a town where almost everyone was armed, things got deadly fast. Forget Hollywood's dramatic gunfights. Real violence in the Wild West was messy, impulsive, and often over the most trivial of matters. Sure, they were handy for personal protection, but they were more commonly used for hunting, scaring off predators, or even sending a signal when needed. When bears, wolves, cougars, and venomous snakes roam the wilderness, going unarmed is practically asking for trouble. And if you're traveling between settlements, forget it. Being defenseless out there could be the last mistake you ever make. Here's a twist you might not expect. Some frontier towns had strict gun control laws. Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona didn't play around. Visitors were required to check their weapons upon entering town. In fact, the famous gunfight at the OK Corral wasn't about heroism. It started because the Clanton gang refused to follow Tombstone's firearm rules. In those high noon standoffs you see in movies? Pure fiction. Most shootings weren't flashy or fair. They were ambushes, robberies gone wrong, or impulsive outbursts. Violence on the frontier was messy, chaotic, and had zero room for honor or justice. As you keep walking, you pass the doctor's office. A glance inside would tell you all you need to know about medical care in the 1870s. Terrifying. Most doctors had little to no formal training, and surgeries were brutal. Forget modern anesthesia. You'd be lucky to get a swig of whiskey or a dose of morphine to dull the pain. Sterilization? Not even close. Instruments were reused without cleaning, and infections were rampant. Something as simple as a cut could mean amputation or death. Treatments like bloodletting and mercury compounds often did more harm than good. For women, childbirth was especially dangerous. In remote areas, 1 in 4 mothers didn't survive. Dentistry wasn't much better. If you had a toothache, your options were limited to excruciating extractions with crude tools and no pain relief. Most people endured years of agony before finally losing all their teeth. It wasn't just survival of the fittest. It was survival of the luckiest. Are you starting to feel sleepy? Hold on. Don't drift off just yet. There's still so much left to uncover, and trust me, it's worth sticking around. Out here, survival wasn't just hard. It was a gamble, and the odds, rarely in your favor. If you got hurt or sick on the frontier, your chances of making it often depended more on sheer luck than on any medical help. A tiny cut could spiral into a deadly infection, and a broken bone might heal wrong, if it healed at all, leaving you with lifelong pain. The famous saying, "Only the strong survive," it wasn't just a phrase, it was the law of the land. Out here, life moved at a relentless pace, and there was no room for weakness. Your stomach growls, snapping you back to the present. Lunchtime. You head to the local restaurant, which is probably just the back room of someone's home, doubling as a kitchen. The menu, not much different from breakfast. The meat is tough and heavily salted to keep it from spoiling, though it probably already has. Vegetables, if you're lucky enough to get them, are boiled to mush. Food poisoning and dysentery aren't risks. They're guarantees. As you eat, conversations buzz around the room. People talk about Native American raids, the constant threat of outlaw gangs, and the dangers of traveling alone. Despite what the movies might have you believe, Native American attacks were far less common than the constant displacement and aggression they faced from settlers and the U.S. military. Tensions were always simmering, and when they boiled over, it wasn't pretty on either side. But outlaws, they were a real threat. In the vast remote stretches of the frontier, they ruled the roads. With only one sheriff covering thousands of square miles, the law was stretched too thin to keep anyone truly safe. Justice was often left to vigilante mobs. If you were accused of stealing a horse or rustling cattle, there was no trial, just a rope and a tree, and it didn't matter whether you were innocent or guilty. So as you finish your meal and prepare for the next challenge, one thing is clear. The frontier didn't just test your strength. It tested your endurance, your courage, and your will to face whatever came next. Don't get too comfortable. There's more to come. Think you've seen expensive? Wait until you step into the general store. After finishing lunch, you head over to stock up on supplies. But the prices are nothing short of jaw-dropping. Everything costs a small fortune compared to back east. The reason? Transportation out here is a nightmare, long, costly, and unpredictable. Something as simple as a can of peaches might set you back the equivalent of $20 in today's money. For most settlers, nearly every penny went toward essentials like food, tools, and clothing. Comforts and luxuries? Forget it. Those were for the rich or the foolish. The store is also a harsh reminder of just how isolated life is on the frontier. Mail delivery, slow and unreliable at best. Newspapers could be weeks or even months old by the time they arrived, making breaking news a thing of the distant past. And letters from family back east? Sometimes they never came at all. Many settlers moved west, knowing they'd never see their loved ones again. That kind of separation weighed heavy, and for some, it was too much. Depression, alcoholism, and even suicide ran high in these lonely, isolated communities. As you leave the store, you spot dark clouds gathering on the horizon. Here, weather is a life or death situation. There's no forecast to warn you, no radar to track the storm. A sunny afternoon can turn into a disaster in minutes. Blizzards could trap travelers, leaving them to freeze to death. Tornadoes tore through towns without mercy, destroying homes and leaving survivors to fend for themselves. Flash floods swept away wagons and people alike, while droughts slowly strangled the land, killing crops and causing widespread starvation. Even if you were lucky enough to have a solid home, it wasn't much of a fortress. Frontier houses were thrown together from whatever was available. Sod homes on the plains, log cabins in the woods, or simple wooden shacks in town. None of them stood a chance against extreme weather. In the winter, the cold crept inside until it felt like you were living in an icebox. And if the storm outside was loud enough, it drowned out every thought except one: survival. Feel like summer's tough? Imagine trying to sleep in an attic when the heat turns it into an oven. The upper floors, where most people slept, were suffocatingly hot. And there was no relief, no fans, no cool breeze, nothing but the weight of the heat pressing down on you. As storm clouds roll in, you decide it's best to head back to your cabin before the rain hits. On your way, you pass a group of miners trudging towards the local shaft, their faces weary from exhaustion and danger. Mining wasn't just a tough job, it was one of the deadliest. Underground, every shift was a gamble. Cave-ins, toxic gases, explosions from poorly handled blasting powder, and malfunctioning equipment claimed countless lives. And even if you survived the day-to-day risks, the long-term effects were just as brutal. Coal dust caused black lung, and mercury poisoning from gold processing slowly stole your health. But mining wasn't the only dangerous job. Farming came with sharp tools and heavy machinery, none of it designed with safety in mind. Ranching meant wrestling with unpredictable massive animals that could crush you in an instant. And logging? It was a fatal game of dodge with falling trees and rolling logs. Whatever your trade, the risk of serious injury or death was part of the deal. Out here, no job came without a price. You make it back to your cabin just as the rain starts to pour. The roof leaks in several places, and you scatter buckets to catch the dripping water. Oddly enough, this is a chance to refill your drinking supply. Clean water is so scarce out here that many settlers drink from the same sources used by their livestock, streams filled with dirt and bacteria. It's no wonder waterborne illnesses often turned deadly. Sitting in your leaky cabin, listening to the rhythmic patter of rain, you can't help but reflect on how far the reality of the Wild West is from the legend. There were no clear-cut heroes or villains here, just ordinary people trying to survive in brutal conditions. The fact that anyone made it through at all is a testament to sheer human grit and determination. Night falls quickly, as it always does when there's no electricity. The only light comes from candles and oil lamps, flickering weakly in the darkness. You're cautious with them. One wrong move, and a fire could consume everything you own. The storm outside rages on, but inside it's the silence that feels the loudest. And as the shadows grow longer, you're reminded that out here, every day is a battle, and every night, a fragile victory. Without fire departments, flames spread fast and wide, and many towns saw their buildings reduced to ash at least once in their history. It was just another brutal reality of life on the frontier. You prepare for bed, worn out after just one day in the Wild West. Your muscles ache like never before. Your stomach churns from the strange, heavy food, and your mind feels stretched thin from the constant effort to stay alive. As your head hits the pillow, if you can call it that, you can't help but wonder, will you make it through tomorrow, or will you become another grim statistic in the story of the untamed frontier? Outside, the wind howls like a ghost, a stark reminder of how small and fragile humans are against the vast, wild wilderness. If tomorrow comes, it will bring the same relentless challenges, and probably a few new ones you can't even imagine yet. In the Wild West, survival wasn't a given. It was earned day by day, moment by moment, through hardships that most modern people could hardly comprehend. When the morning light slips through the cracks in your cabin walls, it pulls you from a restless sleep. Your body protests as you sit up, stiff and aching from the unforgiving mattress. But there's no time to dwell on it. The Wild West doesn't wait for anyone. As you rise, yesterday's harsh lessons play in your mind. The struggles, the danger, the endless toil, it's all waiting for you again today, with maybe even more surprises. You take a deep breath and start to prepare. Let's say today you decide to leave town and travel across the frontier. Maybe you're heading to a new settlement, joining a wagon train to chase dreams out west, or simply exploring the unknown. Either way, travel in the 1870s was nothing like what you know today. Here's the good news. By now, the Transcontinental Railroad has connected the east and west coasts of America, making cross-country travel faster and safer. The bad news? Unless you're wealthy or heading between major cities, it's probably out of your reach. Most frontier folks got around on foot, by wagon, or if they were lucky, by horse. If you owned a horse, you were doing well. But for many settlers, a horse was a luxury they couldn't afford, not just to buy, but to maintain. Even the simplest journey here was a test of endurance and resourcefulness. And as you set out, you know the road ahead holds both promise and peril. A decent horse might cost you several months' wages, and that's just the start. You'd also need saddles, bridles, feed, and some form of veterinary care, though vet care often meant putting the poor animal down if it broke a leg or got sick. And riding, far from a pleasure cruise. Saddles in the 1870s weren't built for comfort. They were built to get the job done. Spend a few hours in one, and even the most seasoned riders ended up with blisters and sore muscles. To make matters worse, horses spooked easily at snakes, sudden noises, or even a gust of wind. One wrong move and you could be thrown, left with broken bones or worse, miles from any help. Can't afford a horse? Then you're stuck traveling by wagon, but let's not romanticize that either. Forget the cheerful pioneer scenes you've seen in movies. Wagon travel was grueling. These wooden vehicles had no suspension beyond the slight give of their wheels, which meant every rock, rut, and pothole on the trail rattled through your entire body. The constant jolting could leave even the toughest travelers nauseous and miserable, a condition known as wagon sickness, a frontier version of seasickness. Roads, if you could call them that, they were little more than dirt paths carved by those who came before. After rain, they turned into muddy traps that swallowed wagons axle deep. When dry, they churned up so much dust you could barely breathe or see. Breakdowns were almost guaranteed. Wheels cracked, axles snapped, and repairs had to be made on the spot, often in the middle of nowhere. Now, let's say you're one of the bold souls heading all the way to California or Oregon. You've joined a wagon train traveling west along the legendary Oregon Trail. This 2,000-mile journey wasn't just long, it was deadly. Of the 400,000 people who attempted the trail between the 1840s and 1860s, about 1 in 10 didn't make it. The trail earned its grim nickname as the nation's longest graveyard. Think about it. Historians estimate 10 to 15 people died for every mile of that trail. Every mile. As you look down the long, dusty road ahead, it's hard not to wonder, will you make it to the end? Or will your story end here, just another marker on the trail? Workers in frontier factories, mills, and workshops faced unimaginable dangers. Machinery lacked safety guards, leading to horrific injuries like severed limbs or crushed hands. Construction workers scaled increasingly tall structures without harnesses, often falling to their deaths. Railroad work, though essential, was among the riskiest. Track layers toiled with minimal tools under brutal conditions, enduring exhaustion, heat stroke, and frequent accidents. Chinese laborers, who built much of the transcontinental railroad, were given the most hazardous tasks. Handling unstable explosives to carve through mountain passes was often a death sentence. The workday was tiring, 10 to 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. Pay was meager, barely enough to survive. Child labor was widespread, with kids as young as 8 working alongside adults. Their small size and inexperience made them more prone to injuries. Workers had no legal protections. Employers could fire them without reason, slash their pay, or withhold wages entirely. Complaining or trying to organize for better conditions often led to blacklisting, ensuring no one else in the area would hire them. In company towns, the situation was even bleaker. Mining and lumber companies owned the housing, stores, and even the currency. Workers paid inflated prices at company stores, lived in basic company housing, and were often paid in scrip, money usable only within the town. This system trapped them in debt, making escape nearly impossible. Whether you mined, ranched, farmed, or worked for wages, frontier life shaped every aspect of your experience. Perhaps the most striking difference was how time was understood, not in precise hours and minutes, but in rhythms of daylight, seasons, and work. Without electricity, people woke with the sun and slept shortly after it set. Days stretched or shrank with the seasons. Work wasn't measured in shifts, but by tasks. Fields needed plowing, cattle had to be moved, or ore had to be extracted. During harvest or roundups, people worked from dawn until well after dark for weeks on end. In winter, rural workers had slower periods when the fields lay dormant, or cattle required little attention. Punctuality as we know it today held little importance. Few owned clocks, and most activities didn't require precise timing. Morning or after dinner was specific enough for daily life. Stagecoaches and trains introduced more rigid schedules, but outside those contexts, time flowed differently. Leisure and entertainment looked nothing like today's digital distractions. After exhausting days, people had little energy for complex activities. Evenings were often spent by the fire, sharing stories, talking, or playing simple card games. Music brought joy when instruments were available, with fiddles, harmonicas, and guitars creating lively tunes for dances. Books were rare treasures, often shared among entire communities. A single novel might be read aloud to neighbors or passed around until it literally fell apart. Newspapers, when they reached the frontier, were read cover-to-cover ads and all, providing a glimpse of the wider world. Organized sports were simple. Baseball was played with minimal equipment, and horse racing, wrestling, or shooting competitions combined fun with practical skills. Children played games requiring little more than imagination. Tag, hide and seek, and stickball, with whatever they could find, were staples of childhood. Life on the frontier was raw, relentless, and unforgiving. It demanded everything from its people and gave back little in return. Yet, in the spaces between work and survival, they carved out moments of connection, resilience, and hope. Until now, you must be wondering how people in the Wild West found joy in a world so harsh. Holidays and community celebrations were their lifeline to happiness. The 4th of July wasn't just a patriotic event. It was a beacon of connection. People traveled miles to share picnics, hear speeches, play games, and dance until their feet ached. Harvest festivals weren't just about food. They marked the end of back-breaking work, a collective sigh of relief. Religious holidays brought not just faith, but a rare chance to pause and reflect, breaking the monotony of endless labor. As the day winds down, you think about the sheer grit it took to live this life. Every task demanded more effort, more risk, and offered fewer rewards than anything most of us will ever know. Survival wasn't just about physical strength. It was about mastering countless skills and finding the mental toughness to keep going through unrelenting challenges. Night descends, bringing with it an almost eerie silence. No cars rumble in the distance, no phones buzz with notifications. Instead, you hear the soft rustle of wind, the hum of insects, and the occasional call of a night bird. This deep quiet is alarming yet oddly calming, a stark reminder of how far removed the frontier was from today's busy world. As you lie under a sky bursting with stars, a question lingers. Could you do it? Could you survive? Not just a day or two, but year after relentless year. The people who lived here weren't the romanticized heroes of stories. They were complicated, flawed, and resilient beyond belief. Above you, the Milky Way stretches like a cosmic highway, its beauty untouched by light pollution. This was one rare gift the frontier offered, a night sky so vivid it felt like the universe was within reach. It's a view we can barely imagine today, a reminder of how connected they were to the same stars their ancestors gazed upon. Morning arrives, and with it comes hunger, an unwelcome but constant companion. Eating in the 1870s wasn't about taste or variety. It was about survival. If you were lucky, you could hunt. Games like deer, elk, rabbits, and birds were still plentiful. But hunting wasn't free. Ammunition was expensive and needed for protection too. Hunting also stole time you couldn't spare during planting or harvesting seasons. Most families relied on the same staples: beans, corn, and pork. These foods were filling but repetitive, offering little in terms of nutrition. Fresh fruits and vegetables, a fleeting luxury, only available for a few months. Winters were particularly brutal, with diets often devoid of anything fresh. This lack of variety wreaked havoc on health. Scurvy was a common enemy. Bleeding gums, loose teeth, aching joints, it was a painful reminder of how little they had to work with. Other deficiencies stunted children's growth and left adults battling chronic health issues. Preserving food was an art born of necessity. Without refrigeration, meat had to be smoked, salted, or dried. These methods kept it from spoiling, but stripped it of flavor and texture, leaving it tough and salty. Every meal was a testament to ingenuity and survival. On the frontier, even eating wasn't just about nourishment, it was a daily fight against nature's indifference. Can you imagine opening a bag of flour and just shrugging at the insect parts inside? On the frontier, that was normal. Preserving food was a lifeline. Every family knew their survival depended on saving enough during the harvest to last through the winter. Women spent hours pickling vegetables, fermenting them, or drying fruits. If sugar was available, they might preserve fruit in sweet syrups. Root vegetables were buried in root cellars, cool underground shelters that kept them edible for months. But here's the catch. Preservation was risky. Do it right, and your food might last until spring. Do it wrong, and spoilage or food poisoning could wipe out your family's supplies, or worse. Even properly stored food wasn't safe. Rats, mice, and bugs always found a way in, leaving droppings and nibbling their share. What did families do about it? They accepted it. A few insect parts or rodent droppings in your beans or flour weren't ideal, but they were better than starvation. Now, imagine cooking in these conditions. Think it was as simple as tossing something on the stove? Not even close. Meals were prepared over open hearths or wood-burning stoves, which required constant attention and fuel. If you lived on the treeless plains, guess what your fuel was? Buffalo chips, dried manure, or twisted grass. Women and children spent hours gathering these materials just to keep the fire alive. Water wasn't on tap either. Families hauled it from wells or streams, carrying hundreds of pounds daily for drinking, cooking, and cleaning. And after all that effort, the food was bland. Spices were rare treasures. Sugar and coffee were hoarded for special occasions. Fresh milk? Only if your cow was producing, and that wasn't year-round. Could you handle that? And yet, obesity was unheard of. People were lean, but not necessarily healthy. The lack of variety left many malnourished, even when they had enough to eat. Now, let's talk about childhood. Do you picture carefree games and laughter? Think again. Childhood on the frontier was a job. Kids as young as 6 worked hard, minding livestock, picking vegetables, or gathering eggs. By 10, they were doing almost everything an adult could do. Boys worked the fields or hunted alongside their fathers. Girls didn't just help with cooking or cleaning. They made soap, candles, clothing, and preserved food. Childhood wasn't a time to be sheltered. It was a time to learn survival. Children saw everything: births, deaths, animal slaughter, and even violent disputes. Shielding them from reality wasn't an option. What about school? It existed, but only in some places, and even then, it was far from ideal. Schools were small, often just one poorly insulated room. One teacher handled students ranging from 5 to 17 years old, with only a few shared textbooks and slates. Paper was so precious that it was treated like gold. Discipline? Let's just say a whispered word or a forgotten lesson could earn you a whipping. For families too far from towns, school wasn't an option. Education at home focused on practical skills: tracking animals, predicting weather, planting crops, and treating injuries. Can you imagine growing up learning survival instead of algebra? And then there was death. Child mortality was heartbreakingly common. 1 in 4 children didn't live to adulthood. Diseases like measles, diphtheria, and whooping cough were relentless killers. Safety was a foreign concept. Kids took risks daily because survival demanded it. The constant loss shaped families in ways we can barely comprehend today. Parents expected to lose children. Siblings grew up watching each other die. Some families even reused names for younger children after an older one passed, a practice born from necessity rather than sentimentality. If you fell sick or got hurt in the 1870s West, your experience would feel like stepping into a nightmare. Professional medical care? Rare if it existed at all. Many communities had no doctors, and those who did practice were often minimally trained, relying on outdated methods closer to medieval practices than modern science. So, what did people do? They turned to home remedies and folk medicine. Every community had healers, usually women, drawing on traditions from their cultures. Some remedies worked, like herbal treatments with genuine medicinal properties. Others, like bloodletting or purging, weakened already ill patients or made things worse. Imagine having a wound treated with a poultice made of questionable substances, sometimes introducing infections instead of preventing them. Pain relief was equally crude. Laudanum, an opium-based tincture, dulled pain, but often led to addiction. Mercury compounds were used despite their toxicity. Even legitimate medicines were risky, unregulated, impure, and often contaminated. Patent medicines, marketed as cure-alls, were mostly alcohol. People felt temporary relief, but the underlying problems remained. Surgery. It was horrifying. Without modern anesthesia, patients endured procedures with little more than whiskey, opium, or sheer grit to numb the pain. Sterilization was unheard of, so post-surgical infections were rampant. Amputation was common for serious injuries, performed with saws and knives that might be wiped down but never properly cleaned. Can you imagine watching that happen? Childbirth was perhaps the most dangerous medical experience. Most women gave birth at home, attended by midwives or female relatives if they were lucky. Without prenatal care, complications often went unnoticed until it was too late. Breech births, hemorrhages, and other emergencies frequently claimed the lives of mothers' babies or both. Maternal mortality was staggering, around 1 death per 100 births. Women approached each pregnancy knowing it could be their last. Think about the psychological toll of that. Diaries from men often mention raising children alone after their wives died in childbirth. It was a grim reality, one that shaped families in ways we can barely imagine today. Now, consider the broader impact of life on the frontier. Communication moved at the pace of physical transportation. Letters took weeks or months to arrive, if they made it at all. News traveled slowly, often distorted along the way. By the time people in remote areas heard about major events, months had passed. This isolation created a highly localized worldview. Distant events felt abstract compared to immediate community concerns. For those used to tight-knit family and friend networks, the loneliness was unbearable. Women, in particular, struggled with this. Imagine being alone for days or weeks while your husband traveled for work or supplies. No one to talk to, no one to help. Some broke under the pressure. Prairie madness, as it was called, described severe depression, anxiety, and even psychosis brought on by isolation, relentless work, and harsh conditions. Some individuals became violent or took their own lives. Others abandoned their homesteads entirely, retreating east to escape the mental strain. Even in established communities, socializing was rare and hard-earned. Visiting neighbors could mean traveling miles on foot or horseback. Formal gatherings were tied to church services, harvest festivals, or barn raisings. These events weren't just social, they were lifelines to connection and cooperation. Churches played a central role, acting as more than just spiritual hubs. They were meeting places, schools, and support networks. Even those with little religious belief often participated for the sense of belonging they provided. Ministers and priests wore many hats, serving as teachers, mediators, and organizers. Building schools, churches, or town halls marked a shift from survival to settlement. These structures symbolized a commitment to staying, to building a future. Local governments, often rudimentary, grew from the need to establish order and community identity. Survival on the frontier wasn't a solo endeavor. Mutual aid and collective action were essential. Communities banded together to help one another through harsh winters, crop failures, or personal tragedies. The people of the Wild West didn't just endure. They built a world from nothing, relying on grit, ingenuity, and each other. Have you ever wondered how people managed to build communities in a land so wild and unforgiving? In the Wild West, families couldn't raise barns or build houses alone. That's where barn raisings and house raisings came in. Entire communities gathered, turning impossible tasks into celebrations of cooperation. Harvest teams moved from farm to farm, racing to gather crops before unpredictable weather ruined them. And when a child went missing, search parties formed on the spot, combing the wilderness with urgency and hope. This spirit of cooperation stood side by side with the rugged individualism we so often hear about. Both were vital. Self-reliance kept people alive day to day, but only through community effort could they tackle challenges beyond one family's capacity. This tension between independence and interdependence shaped not just frontier life, but the very culture of America, influencing ideas about government, community, and responsibility even today. As the day winds down, you reflect on the mental and emotional strength it took to survive here. These weren't superhumans. They were ordinary people facing extraordinary odds. They broke under the pressure sometimes, but many adapted, finding ways to endure, even thrive. Night falls, and with it comes that profound, almost haunting silence. No hum of machinery, no distant car engines, just the rustle of wind and the occasional call of a night bird. It's so deep, it forces you inward, making you ponder the resilience of those who built lives here. What drove them to keep going through blizzards, droughts, illness, and unimaginable loss? What dreams sustained them? And what would they think of the world their sacrifices made possible? A world of comfort and abundance they could scarcely imagine. As sleep overtakes you, your mind drifts to endless prairies and towering mountains. The faces of those who tamed the West appear, not through gunfights, but through the quiet heroism of daily persistence. Their story is one of adaptability, courage, and an unyielding will to survive. Morning arrives on what will be your final day in the Wild West. The golden light spills over a landscape that, despite its hardships, is undeniably breathtaking. Endless prairies ripple like ocean waves, and towering mountains scrape the sky. You can understand why so many were drawn here. But the relationship with this natural beauty was far from what we think of today. To settlers, nature wasn't a wonder to be preserved. It was a resource to be conquered. Forests were cut without thought for regrowth. Game animals were hunted to near extinction. Rivers were diverted or polluted for mining, with no concern for the consequences downstream. Perhaps the most heart-wrenching example of this exploitation is the near extermination of the American bison. Once numbering 30 to 60 million, fewer than 1,000 remained by 1884. This wasn't just overhunting. It was deliberate policy. By destroying the bison, the U.S. government sought to destroy the livelihoods of Plains Indian tribes, forcing them onto reservations. General Philip Sheridan reportedly said, "Let them kill, skin, and sell until the buffalo is exterminated. It is the only way to bring peace and allow civilization to advance." Whether or not he said these exact words, they reflect the brutal policies of the time. The bison's destruction was environmental warfare, aimed at breaking indigenous resistance by cutting off their primary resource. For Native American nations, westward expansion wasn't just displacement, it was an apocalypse. Their economies, spiritual practices, and cultural identities, deeply tied to the land, were systematically dismantled. Some indigenous groups tried to coexist through trade and cooperation, but by the 1870s, their options were grim. Confinement on reservations, resistance against overwhelming odds, or cultural assimilation. The reservation system was a form of cultural genocide. Native children were forcibly removed from their families and sent to boarding schools designed to kill the Indian and save the man. At schools like the Carlisle Indian Industrial School, children's hair was cut short. They were forbidden to speak their languages, practice their religions, or maintain their cultural identities. The trauma of these policies reverberates in Native communities to this day. Armed resistance often ended in tragedy. One of the last major indigenous victories, the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, was followed by brutal military campaigns. Villages were attacked, and women and children were killed. The rich agricultural systems, governance structures, and cultural traditions of many tribes were lost or overshadowed. Have you ever wondered what it was really like when the Wild West brought the world together, only to watch it clash? The frontier was a collision of cultures, values, and ambitions. Many Native American groups, for instance, couldn't understand the idea of owning land. To them, land was like the air or the stars, something no one could truly possess. This fundamental difference in perspective made treaty negotiations over territory fraught with misunderstanding from the very beginning. But cultural conflicts didn't stop there. The West was a kaleidoscope of diversity, with communities from all over the world bringing their languages, religions, and traditions. This diversity was a double-edged sword. It introduced incredible skills and perspectives, but also sparked tension as resources grew scarce. and communities struggled to coexist. Chinese immigrants played vital roles in building railroads and developing mining operations, but they paid a steep price. They faced violent discrimination, driven from lucrative mining claims, and targeted by laws like the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the first major U.S. law to restrict immigration based on nationality. When economic conditions soured, Chinese communities often suffered riots and mass expulsions. Mexican Americans, many of whom became U.S. citizens after territorial acquisitions, faced their own battles. Promised property rights after the Mexican-American War, they often saw their lands taken through fraud, intimidation, or legal manipulation. Traditional water right systems, which had worked for generations, were replaced with less effective laws imported from the East. Even European immigrants encountered challenges. Irish Catholics, German Lutherans, Scandinavian Protestants, and Eastern European Jews formed tight-knit communities for mutual support. Yet these groups often became targets of prejudice when economic or social tensions flared. African Americans who ventured west after the Civil War hoped for freedom from Southern oppression. While some found opportunities, many faced different forms of discrimination. Black cowboys made up about 25% of the workforce on some cattle operations. But their contributions were rarely acknowledged in the stories of the time or in later myths. Black homesteaders faced organized resistance from neighbors and unequal application of homestead laws. With so many groups vying for space and resources, frontier towns became far more complex and conflicted than romanticized depictions suggest. The melting pot metaphor popularized later ignored the reality that not all cultures blended equally. Power imbalances ensured some traditions thrived while others were suppressed. But what about the transformation of these frontier towns? Imagine standing in a bustling town in the 1870s or 1880s, watching history shift in real time. At first, these settlements were wild places dominated by independent miners, farmers, and small businesses. But then came the railroads. The completion of the Transcontinental Railroad in 1869 changed everything, cutting travel time from months to days. Branch lines soon connected isolated areas, linking them to national markets. This transportation revolution brought prosperity for some, but spelled trouble for others. Large corporations moved in, out-competing small miners, ranchers, and farmers. Family farms couldn't stand against vast agricultural enterprises. Independent ranchers were pushed out by cattle companies with deep pockets and political clout. The railroads, mining mixtures, and timber companies didn't just dominate the economy, they influenced politics too. Land rights, water access, and resource control were decided in ways that favored those with money and connections, leaving small operators struggling. As towns grew, they transformed. What once were rough mining camps and cattle towns gained banks, schools, churches, and newspapers. Streets were surveyed and sometimes paved. Wooden shacks gave way to brick and stone buildings. Local governments began enacting laws to regulate behavior that had previously gone unchecked. For some, these changes felt like progress. For others, they represented the death of the freedom they had sought in the West. Unable to adapt, many simply moved further west, chasing the frontier as civilization encroached. The myth of the Wild West officially ended with the 1890 census, which declared the frontier closed. But for those who had built their lives there, the psychological shift was profound. How do you adjust when your identity is tied to a world that no longer exists? What about the famous outlaws and lawmen of this era? Names like Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, and Jesse James conjure images of daring gunfights and larger-than-life adventures. But the truth was far darker. These figures lived in a time when formal law enforcement was still establishing itself, and justice often came in the form of vigilante action. By the 1880s and 1890s, professional police forces and courts began replacing the chaotic systems of personal and community justice. But remote areas still saw their share of frontier-style conflict. Figures like Hickok and Earp often straddled the line between law and lawlessness, taking on whatever role circumstances demanded. Their stories, later romanticized, obscured the messy realities of their lives. These were survivors, navigating a world where survival often required moral compromises. Why does the Wild West, with all its hardships and brutality, still captivate our imagination? As the sun sets on your final day in the Wild West, you can't help but reflect on the massive gap between the gritty reality you've experienced and the shiny, polished myths we've been sold. What is it about this time and place that has inspired generations of stories, songs, and films? Why do we cling to a romanticized version of a period that was, by all accounts, relentless and unforgiving? Part of the answer lies in the timing. Just as the actual frontier was vanishing, a new mythology was being born. Buffalo Bill Cody's Wild West shows, starting in the 1880s, brought staged battles and dramatic reenactments to Eastern audiences. These performances weren't about truth. They were about entertainment, feeding into Eastern fantasies of cowboys and Indians, daring stagecoach robberies, and rugged survival. Meanwhile, dime novels churned out sensationalized tales of Western heroes, written by authors who had never set foot in the frontier. These stories weren't based on real events, but followed a formula: action-packed adventures, clear-cut heroes and villains, and the West as a proving ground for courage, self-reliance, and morality. Then Hollywood came along and took the myth to new heights. Movies painted lone cowboys as noble wanderers, outlaws as charming rogues, and indigenous people as faceless adversaries. These films weren't just entertainment, they were cultural tools. They reassured audiences during times of uncertainty, suggesting that the qualities forged in the frontier, bravery, independence, and resilience, were the foundation of the American character. But what did these myths hide? The truth was far more complicated. Figures like Wild Bill Hickok, Wyatt Earp, and Jesse James weren't straightforward heroes. Hickok, for all his fame, accidentally shot innocent bystanders in gunfights. Earp wore many hats: lawman, gambler, brothel keeper, and sometimes vigilante. Jesse James, celebrated as a Robin Hood figure, was a Confederate guerrilla with a record of violence that left many innocent victims in his wake. As darkness falls, you begin to grasp the true cost of these myths. They gloss over the genocide of indigenous peoples, the exploitation of immigrant labor, and the environmental destruction wrought in the name of progress. They simplify a time that was anything but simple, a time when survival demanded constant adaptation, cooperation, and sacrifice. Would you have survived here? Could you have endured the relentless challenges of this life? The Wild West was not for the faint of heart. The knowledge, skills, and sheer grit required to make it through even a single day would challenge most of us today. Yet, despite the hardships, there's something undeniably compelling about this era. Maybe it's the raw honesty of a life where every task mattered, where achievements were hard-won, and survival itself was a victory. Or perhaps it's the sense of community born from shared struggle, a connection that transcended differences in background or belief. As you lie down under the vast starry sky, the weight of history presses in. These same stars once guided travelers across the prairie, comforted homesick immigrants, and marked the passage of time for indigenous peoples who lived in harmony with the land long before settlers arrived. Tomorrow, you'll return to your modern life, filled with comforts and conveniences the frontier folk could only dream of. But you'll carry with you a new understanding of this pivotal period, a time when human ingenuity, resilience, and sometimes cruelty shaped a nation. The Wild West wasn't all gunfights and gold strikes. Its real story lies in the quiet heroism of ordinary people. Men, women, and children from diverse backgrounds, facing extraordinary challenges with what little they had. Their struggles weren't glamorous, but they were real, and their legacy is woven into the fabric of modern America. As you drift off to sleep, the whisper of the plain wind and the distant howl of coyotes blend into your dreams. You see a land both harsh and beautiful, a place where human vulnerability and resilience were on full display. The Wild West, stripped of its Hollywood glamour, becomes something even more profound. So, the next time you watch a Western film or read a frontier novel, remember the untold stories, the raw truths that shape the myth. Because in the end, the reality of the Wild West, with all its contradictions and complexities, is far richer than the legend.